Thank you all for coming, and thank you for inviting me to do this. As Melinda said, I'm the director of a sculpture park near Salisbury, where we show a lot of artists, a lot of British artists, in 60 acres of very beautiful Wiltshire countryside, including Anthony Caro, which is how I got to know him, in fact. Today I'm going to be talking in sort of two halves. I'm going to start off with a sort of brief resume of a very, very, very long and successful career of Sir Anthony's, and then I'm going to talk about sea music, and then finally touch on the project that we are all involved in at the moment. So, Sir Anthony Caro, O-M-C-B-E-R-A, to give him his full dues, 1924 to 2013. Had a long and prestigious career. I hope everyone, can you hear me at the back? I've got no microphone. He revolutionised British sculpture in terms of subject, appearance, materials, methods and ideas. He broke away from the traditions of European sculpture by showing that it need not be dependent on the human figure. He dispensed with the plinth and expanded the possibilities of sculpture, moving into abstraction. He is still one of Britain's best known and prolific abstract sculptors. He has shown his work in exhibitions around the world, most recently at the Metropolitan, this is the man himself, sorry, that's the man himself, with his wife Sheila Girling, who we will come to a little bit later, who had a great role in all of his sculpture. She was a painter. This is his exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, his retrospective at the Tate. He's had further exhibitions at Venice, Canary Wharf in London, and at Chatsworth. Somebody mentioned Chatsworth earlier today. This is a piece in the grounds of Chatsworth, and at the Yorkshire Sculpture Park. He's known for using steel. His nickname is the Man of Steel, but he used a wide variety of different materials, including bronze, perspex, paper, wood, and gold. He made a series of jewellery, quite heavy jewellery. You can see his work in just about every UK public collection, as well, of course, as here in Poole. And what you have here is unique. Sea music is the only site-specific sculpture in the public realm that Caro ever made. To go back to the beginning, Tony Caro was the son of a stockbroker, and his father didn't think art was a very appropriate career. So whilst he acquiesced by studying engineering at Cambridge University, he was also secretly attending art classes during the holidays, and also worked in the studio of a sculptor called Charles Wheeler. He served in the Royal Navy from 1944 to 46, and it's these two aspects, the fact he served in the Navy and he studied engineering, which I think really shaped the work that comes to follow. Post-war, Caro studied sculpture at the Royal Academy Schools in London between 1947 and 52. The focus of his training was on techniques and skill, and in this rather traditional insular world, there was little discussion about what an artwork could be about. Sculpture was ostensibly, at that stage, architectural decoration, fountains in parks, or large portraits of important men on horseback in prominent positions on a pedestal. At the Royal Academy, students modelled their work in clay and cast them in plaster. Casting in bronze was rare owing to cost. As a student, Caro was described as being intense and driven, if not rebellious. Caro wanted to run before he could walk, a very necessary feeling if you want to push out of the boundaries of sculpture. His energy was frightening, and one sort of flapped along in his wake. By 1952, he felt he had reached the limit of what the Academy could teach him. He wanted to pursue the modern and the avant-garde. He knew Henry Moore was the most important British sculptor working at the time, and went to visit him unannounced. He stayed for tea, and 6 months later, he began working as a part-time studio assistant to Henry Moore. Henry came at a crucial time in my development, he was later to say. Had I had a less good artist, my standards wouldn't have been so high. Moore allowed Caro to borrow books on painting, sculpture, architecture, African and oceanic art. His mind became full of images and ideas. Moore and Caro also had many discussions about what sculpture was, what it could be. He said Henry had a mind that was a pleasure to meet, extraordinary, so inquiring, and he was quite prepared to throw the ball in the air and see if you could catch it. This sense of inquiry is key to Caro, trying something new to see if it works without knowing the results. But this sense that he was reacting to what had happened before and was constantly trying to move forward restlessly is also vital to understanding him. Indeed, there comes a moment when he feels he's outgrown Henry Moore and does a lot to distance himself from everything that Henry Moore stood for. The subjects Caro was working on at this stage are still figurative and even made still lives, but the roughly textured surface he used was a way of establishing a distance between himself and the work of his master. In 1953, Caro began teaching at St Martin's School of Art and established himself as an independent artist. He met other artists and crucially architects like Richard Rogers. His students included Richard Long and Barry Flanagan, both of whom interestingly rejected everything Caro stood for as well, in their own way. He describes his teaching as a journey of discovery, finding what sculpture could be in terms of subject, materials and methods. He felt figure-based sculpture had been drained of all expressive possibility and wanted to find new ways for sculpture to convey meaning and feeling. He said teaching at this time was a tremendous opening for me. Anything was possible in those years. It wasn't just the material that was important. What was important was the whole examination of what sculpture could be to you in your life. It was no longer an object to put on a mantelpiece and forget about. It needn't be seen from a distance on top of a hill. It was a question of how it could be far more immediate. Caro continued teaching at St Martin's until 1979, and he also went to Bennington College in Vermont in the USA from 1953 to 65. Going to America, there was something of a seismic shift, and he found something that he'd been looking for all his fledgling career in the work of an American sculptor called David Smith. He also learned that art did not have to illustrate a subject, but that the feeling and mood could be implied, and that the artist's emotional response to something could also be reflected. He met a notable art critic called Clement Greenberg, who criticised Caro, telling him, if you want to change your art, change your habits. When he returned to Britain, Caro decided to start using new materials. He visited scrapyards and purchased steel girders, I-beams and other steel elements. He also began to place sculpture directly on the ground. Viewing sculpture on the ground now seems quite commonplace, but it was revolutionary in the 1960s, and it was taken up by many sculptors of the time. When on the ground, sculpture becomes part of the space, the same space as the viewer. It becomes part of the world of real objects and real people. It makes the experience of interacting with sculpture more real. Caro first made a big impression sculpturally in the 1960s, and in the works of this period he does not imply the human figure, but rather in an abstract, disembodied way they equate with coming into contact with a living presence. And this idea that sculpture has a character all of its own is enhanced by Caro's use of paint. By using colour with its emotional associations, he animates and humanises the sculpture yet further. These two works I've just shown you date from this very early period and an important exhibition at the Whitechapel Gallery in London in 1963, which included perhaps his most famous work, Early One Morning, which is in the collection at the Tate. With the exhibition at the Whitechapel, it was realised that Caro had thrown open the idea of what a sculpture can be. The work is not an enclosed solid form, it's been opened out and expanded. The work is about lightness and weight, balance, gravity, space and volume. he uses steel I-beams, circular aluminium tubes, sheets of steel, welded and bolted together. It's quite interesting talking to Pat Cunningham, who's involved in the project to restore Sea Music, who's worked for the Caro studio since 1968 and was brought in because he had great technical skill. At this early stage, Caro knew what he wanted to do, but he couldn't necessarily do it himself. And Pat describes him as a terrible welder. I wouldn't be able to judge, but... The linear elements activate the surrounding space and imply a trace of the artist's own movements as he created the sculpture. Each element has a complex formal relationship to the other parts which unfold as the viewer walks around the work. Caro is concerned about the internal connections of the various parts. Such works were made in his garage, with basic tools and limited experience. In fact, early one morning it became so large he had to drag it out of the garage and onto the lawn in his back garden to continue working on it. Only when the work is taken outside can you view it at a distance. The element of surprise and improvisation was always present. The next key moment in Caro's career comes with a series called The Flats. Sculptures made from rusted and varnished steel in the 1970s at the York Steel Company in Toronto. There, Caro, for the first time, was able to make use of materials and equipment which allowed him to make a large body of work from thick, heavy sheets of steel, quickly and spontaneously and often concurrently. There's a story of him working, there's about 20 works in this series, all of which are vast, and there's a story of him dotting from one to another. Working on one sculpture gave him an idea for the next, and working on that one informed his decisions about the one that followed, and so he could be working on 5 or 6 of these huge sculptures all at the same time. The results, as such, can have a commanding and unyielding structure, but at the same time, the arrangement of flat surfaces can be seen to be more haphazard and unstable, so the shape of them looks like they might shift at any moment. He also developed a series of works, epic works, I've written here, which explored the relationship between sculpture and architecture, such as Goodwood Steps. This is at Chatsworth. Goodwood Steps is one of a large number of monumental stepped works, of which 2, Halifax Steps and Millbank Steps, which were originally conceived and shown inside. Millbank Steps originally formed the centrepiece of his retrospective at the Tate in 2005 and is now shown in the sculpture park that I run. The Step series are Caro at his most architectural. Arguably, it is only when they are seen in the landscape that they can most convincingly be regarded as sculptures. Whilst the viewer can enter the cathedral-like space, sorry, I've lost the name of space here, it's only when you step back that it's possible to experience it as an object. The same is true, the same is true of Sea Music. And it seems entirely appropriate for a sculptor like Caro, who's been preoccupied with the conception and representation of sculptural space, to show his work where there is enough space, beyond the confines of the gallery and unrestricted by walls, so that you can see it up close and also from afar. Certainly, by taking sculpture off its plinth, as he did in the 1960s, Caro ensured that sculpture became part of the environment in which it's located, and created an unmediated, intimate encounter. And as Sea Music demonstrates, the experience of his work is just as compelling when it happens outdoors. Situated on Poole Quay, Sea Music is an example of Caro's sculptecture. It's a slightly ugly term, I always feel, and slightly difficult to say, but it's one where he combined his interest in both sculpture and architecture. And as I've said, as we all said, it's the only site-specific sculpture in the public realm in the UK. It was commissioned in 1989 at the invitation of Tom Roberts, then Borough Architect.